We are starting to go behind the Autodesk Revit software from the first episode of the cycle of our training courses about building information modeling. So, let's begin with one of the most problematic themes. It's users' families editing. You might wonder why we are starting from the hardest one and not the other way around like in most courses. The thing is that there is just no choice. We know that the Revit model consists of the components, which are called families in Revit context. And there are two types of them. The first one is loadable families, and the second one is system families. Developers have configured the system families in advance, and they have granted to the user only a range of instruments and parameters that allow changing the configuration of these families a little. For instance, let's consider a wall family. Well, the user has got some parameters and he can change the wall width, the bunch of layers, the materials of layers, and etc. Unfortunately, the user won't be able to create any wall with this instrument. He can only create a wall which is conceived by the developers of Revit. Nevertheless, there is a family editor for such purposes. The user can design the geometry, attach parameters to them, and determine the behavior of the families. So, there is much more freedom. However, that instrument is more complicated. Such families that developers didn't design in advance are usually created in Family Editor. For instance, it is impossible to imagine a bunch of parameters for furniture which would provide a detailed outline of all kinds of furniture, such as chairs, tables, and etc. So, developers decided that users will create them themselves and created an editor for those purposes. The same applies to windows, doors, columns, and many other objects. Well, why don't we begin our studies from the system families, since they are much more straightforward. Their behavior is already defined, and we don't have to parameterize them. The thing is that can nest one loadable family into another loadable family. Moreover, that behavior has already been defined by the developers of the Revit, that is, many system families host nested families. I'll explain these in the examples. Let's consider the system family of the grid line. That's one of the simplest families, and it looks sort of like this. As I have already mentioned, it's a system family, but there is a nested loadable family, the title of the grid inside of it. Namely, this is a loadable family, and it's created in the Family Editor. Naturally, there are some loadable families that have already existed in Revit, and they exist in completed templates and libraries that the developer supplies with Revit. As is the case with the grid line, the title we need will be in such templates. But there are other different nested family types that are required for the work of the system families. Let's review such objects as railings. Well, railing is a system family. It looks sort of like this. There are top rail, balusters, and handrails. To be more exact, the top rail and handrails are the nested system families, and balusters are the nested loadable families. So, there isn't a strong possibility that the baluster that we need for the project would be in a standard library, as is the case with the gridline title. As a result, the knowledge of the Family Editor becomes critically important. Moreover, the system families of the handrails and top rail host nested loadable families. There are multiple, but one of the most important is the profile. The profile determines the section configuration of the handrails and top rail. To sum up, if we haven't got sufficient skills to work with the Family Editor, we won't be able to set our unique personal sections for these objects, and many more of those in Revit. By and large, without knowing the Family Editor, we'll have to study the software superficially and prominent the instruments only in their basic configuration. So, we should have in our minds that it's not the approach we seek. So, we are starting to study Revit from the family editor.